Welcome to the Sleep Haunt. Tonight, I'll guide you through 10 quiet stories, tales that drift like slow tides, whispered from rooms that remember, and roads that never truly rest. These aren't stories to startle, but to stay close, steady as breath, carrying you deeper into the night. Stay with me until the last echo, where each thread ties into the next in a calm, lingering hush. If you find peace in nights like this, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another story. And before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where these nights travel. Story number 1. On weeknights, the town library closed at 9, but the building did not go to sleep. Its lights softened, its vents murmured in long breaths, and the floors held the day's warmth like coals under ash. Mara had the last shift on Tuesdays. She liked the quiet. She liked the hollow sound of her steps across the lobby and the way paper softened the air. She had keys for every door and a heavy lanyard that clicked against her hip when she moved. It sounded important, and she enjoyed the feeling. She knew the rituals: log the final returns, sweep the stacks for lost patrons, turn the lamps in the reading room so they sat at that particular glow that looked dignified without wasting electricity. The building had a way it liked things, and the seasoned staff spoke about it the way gardeners spoke about soil. Treat it gently, and it yielded everything. On a rain-polished Tuesday in late autumn, Mara turned the metal sign at the entrance from open to closed and watched the square outside blur under streetlights. The last reader, a man with a wool coat and an umbrella that dripped like a metronome, thanked her on his way out. He left a faint trace of cologne that mingled with the smell of old bindings. She locked the door behind him, felt the satisfying weight of the tumbler sliding home, and turned back to the quiet. The book return slot in the vestibule clicked only after hours. People on their evening walks would slip books into the mouth of the metal box, and the sound would travel like a soft drop into a still pool. That night, the first click came moments after she locked the door. She smiled, imagining a neighbor waving at the dark glass in habit anyway. She rolled the returns cart to the slot and opened the hatch. Inside, under a few paperbacks and a well-worn cookbook, lay a book she did not recognize. It had no dust jacket, just a linen cover the color of light tea, with a title stamped into the spine in letters too faint to read. It felt cool in her hands, as if it had been outside longer than the others. She flipped it open. The pages were slightly feathered. That fine fuzz paper grows when it's old. Inside the front cover, where barcodes usually lived, there was only a card pocket and a stiff, cream-colored card tucked into it. The card made her pause. It had the library's old crest printed at the top, a design she'd only ever seen on a poster in the basement. A tree with roots that turned into lines of text. The stamped dates began in the 1,950 seconds and continued in tidy rows for decades. The last line was crisp and fresh, the ink still raised. It bore tonight's date. The borrower's name, written in blue fountain pen, was a familiar one. Mara's own last name, unusual enough in town that she shared it with only 2 other people, her mother and her uncle. The first name above it made her stomach lift, not with fear exactly, but with a sudden, weightless question. The card said, Eliza Ward, her grandmother. She stood for a long moment with rain thinning on the glass behind her, and the whisper of the ventilation system moving the air. The rational part of her lined up possibilities. A prank, a reprint, a book from a donation box that some well-meaning volunteer had slipped into circulation without checking. She told herself to walk it upstairs to the office and add it to the anomalies pile. But the book's pages, when she let them slide against her thumb, felt used with care, as if they had lived a purposeful life. The title, when the light struck just right, raised itself from the spine, The Listening Room. She looked toward the reading room out of habit. Through the archway lay a landscape of tables and green-shaded lamps, their brass stems making slow shadows. Rain feathered the tall windows, dimming the world outside. An empty chair creaked, and then stilled the way wood settles after being warmed. It was a good room for listening. When it was full, all its noises made a gentle sea. Tonight it held only the quiet that made sound itself feel like someone else's secret. She carried the book to the desk and wrote an entry in the log. Found in after-hours drop. Unbarcoded book, older style. Card suggests recent use. It felt like a small spell, naming something to keep it from being nothing. The clock above the desk said 9:12. She heard the click of the vestibule again, and another gentle thump in the box. Someone else dropping something off in the rain. The door, glossy with light, reflected her as a thin black silhouette. She didn't move to look. Some nights the returns came like that, soft, steady, a tide, down hallways and behind an unassuming door. The library kept its closed stacks, the older, rare, and stubborn volumes that did not like to be handled. The key to that door was always cool, even in summer. She went to slip the book on the cart for later, then found herself sliding the key out and walking toward the closed stacks instead. The building's hum shifted as she approached, as if she'd stepped into the edge of another room. She turned the key, heard the latch withdraw as politely as a neighbor clearing a throat, and let herself in. The closed stacks were a dim forest of shelves, with aisle lights that flicked on when someone was beneath them in soft circles that made islands of brightness. She loved it there. She loved the lilt of titles from other eras, and the braided twine of topics whose language had shifted but whose bones were underneath everything. Tonight the air seemed cooler and less awake. No surprise given the rain. She slipped the book under her arm and walked down the narrow aisle toward the section where strange catalogs and histories of things that were more rumor than fact lived. The first light winked on over her head. Then the second. And then, an odd thing happened. The third light came on ahead. But when she stepped into it, she felt like she'd already been in that pool of glow. It smelled the same. A clean, dry paper smell with a little thread of dust that had been shaken and settled again. The next shelf end should have had a carved stamp from a bookbinder on its corner. She had admired that little flourish dozens of times, but for a heartbeat, it wasn't there. Then it was, as if her brain had reached for it, and the world had smoothed to meet her expectation. She stood still and listened. The closed stacks did not echo. Not exactly. They made a sound like listening makes. A soft absence that has shape. She put the book down on a cart and let her fingers rest on the linen cover. The fabric was slightly damp, as if it had been carried under a coat and tucked tight to stay dry. Mara knew the door to the closed stacks could be finicky. It sometimes shut itself when it was meant to stay ajar, as if the building were tidying up behind people. Tonight, when she glanced back, the door was merely closed. The key was still in the lock, inside the room. No problem. She would finish her curiosity and go back out. She slid the book into place and immediately decided against it. Something about shelving it felt like putting a coin into a fountain and turning away. Instead, she opened it at a random page. She began reading a paragraph about sound. It described how certain rooms, built with attention and lived in for long enough, learn to hold more than noise. They gather intention. They hold what was meant inside them. A listening room, capital letters. The way the book used them was one that had become so practiced at taking in sound that it could give some back. Playing a note, even softly, would bring a harmony weeks or years later. Unfinished songs were sometimes finished by a room when the person who had started them had forgotten. Rooms, the book said, were not empty after all. They were a kind of instrument. She smiled at the poetry of it and kept reading. On the next page, a small pencil mark notated a line about footsteps sounding different to the floor, depending on what the person walking had come to do. The dates in the margin were in a hand she did not know. 1960. 2. 1978. 1989. The last note was faint and careful. 2001. Underlined once. The room will return what is owed. The stack lights hummed companionably. She turned another page. It made a thin sound in the stillness. Somewhere, outside the closed stacks and down the hall, a phone began to ring. She paused, half-turned toward the door. It stopped. She waited. The clock above her head ticked in a way she had never noticed in that part of the building, a bright, steady tick like a metronome. The vestibule thumped again. She told herself to finish, to put the book in the office, and to close down the building as usual. On her way out of the closed stacks, the light above the first aisle did a little flutter. Not a flicker, more a flutter, as if it had felt a draft. She opened the door and felt the warmth of the main floor again. The phone near the information desk rang once. She reached it before the second ring and lifted the receiver. No one spoke. The line held a quiet that sounded exactly like the building around her. She said, "Hello." Not a sound came back, but the hum of the handset shaped itself just enough that her brain offered interpretations. A breath, a far-off shuffling, the suggestion that someone was there, being careful not to disrupt her. She hung up. The rain stepped down a little in intensity at the windows. She rolled the returns cart to the vestibule again and opened the box. On top this time lay a slim, stapled pamphlet with its title lettered by hand. "Field Guide to Echoes," it said. The cover was dark with drizzle. The pages inside were tidy and precise, illustrated with pencil drawings of waveforms like ripples in a pond. The author was listed as E. Ward. A coincidence, she told herself. Eliza was a common enough name decades ago. Ward. In certain parts of the country, too. On the counter, beside the stapler and the bookmark display, sat the old card catalog that the library had kept for nostalgia and because people enjoyed touching small drawers with brass pulls. Entire records had been digitized long ago, but sometimes someone liked to slide a drawer out and riffle the stiff cards. Mara had never seen one move on its own. A drawer near the middle slid an inch, then another. Then gently, as if someone were being considerate, it eased itself the rest of the way out and set down on the stops. The cards inside did not fan or collapse. They waited. She took a step toward it. The top card, blank with a faint watermark, trembled as a breath might stir it. Then a line appeared, as if someone were writing with an invisible pen from the other side of the paper. It was slow, the way ink from a well behaves when wicked into a pause. The letters formed without haste. Mara's first name in a script she knew from old photographs of grocery lists pinned under magnets on her grandmother's fridge. It did not frighten her. It landed in her the way a found song lyric can feel both unexpected and inevitable. She reached for the card and felt the paper warm where someone's hand might have been moments ago. Then the warmth faded. The book on the cart, The Listening Room, lay open to a page she did not remember leaving it on. A paragraph described the proper method for returning something a room had lent. "Do not take it outside without asking," it advised. The sentence was underlined in faint pencil. "If it has come through a door, bring it back through that same door, with thanks." She had not taken the book outside, but it had come in through the return slot in the vestibule, and the idea that the building had its own way of doing and undoing things stopped being fanciful. She closed the book and held it like a loaf of bread. Mara walked to the vestibule. The windows, fogged softly from the temperature difference, turned the square beyond into a watercolor of trees and lamps. She slid the hatch open, set the book within, and let it fall with a gentle thud onto the padded bottom. The sound was richer than the paperbacks. It felt like placing a stone back where the river wanted it. The phone rang again. She jogged to the desk, lifted the receiver, and this time did not speak. The silence on the other end was not empty. It made room. In the span of a long blink, she noticed details she had never consciously catalogued. The way the exit sign's green cast a slow-moving shadow down the corridor, the faint lemon scent from the night crew's cleaning supplies, the click of the old clock above the door failing for one tick, and then catching itself up, skipping ahead an extra second to arrive on time anyway. She whispered, without knowing she would. "Thank you." For what? She could not have said. The line clicked softly like a nod. Then a voice, not a recorded one, not the building's hum, not wind trapped in a vent, came through, gentle and steady, as if it had a life it did not want to startle. It said her name. It was an older voice, careful with syllables, the sort of voice that had taught children the habits of quiet. Mara stared at the receiver. The voice continued, saying things that did not move in straight lines. It mentioned how the east windows throw rectangles of morning light like pages, and the perfect way sound travels between the atlas case and the staircase if someone hums 3 notes just so, and the heavy kindness of the door on winter days when it closes with enough weight to push the last of the cold back out into the street. It did not ask. It did not demand. It left spaces, the way the reading room left spaces around people who needed them. When the voice paused long enough for the call to feel like a held breath, Mara said, "Can I help you?" Because that is what she was trained to say. The voice answered, as if replying to a question she had not asked. It said, "Not help. Keep. Keep the room the way it remembers itself." The line for a moment smelled like old soap, the lavender sort that lived in her grandmother's sewing tin to make buttons smell like summer. The receiver warmed more in her hand. Then the call ended. Not a hang-up. A gentle letting go. 9:30. There were checklists to finish, but Mara moved through them with the sense that she was participating in choreography that had always existed, the way lines in a game board are already there before anyone draws their marker across them. In the reading room, she aimed the lamps so their pools of light overlapped just slightly, the way the long-timers had taught her. A chair sighed as she passed, and a page turned when there was no page to turn. At the end of the night, keys clicked, computers slept, and the lobby settled. She went to the door to leave and saw, through the window's gloss, that the street had gone to a different stillness. The rain had ended. The lamps outside fuzzed themselves with halos, and the courthouse clock across the square read an impossible time. It could not already be early morning. It could not still be just after closing. The minute hand held two positions at once until she blinked and chose one for it. She unlocked the door and pushed. The lobby's air stirred her hair. The door opened, not onto the square, but onto the reading room. The green lamps waited. The carpet smelled the way it always did, like quiet places. She let the door swing back and found, instead of the lobby she had just left, the closed stacks. When she looked again, the vestibule. Then the entry, as it should be, with the welcome mat and the ghost of wet footprints that were not she could not have made. She stood with her palm flat against the cool glass. On the other side, a figure sat at one of the reading tables, reading. She could see only the shape of shoulders in a sweater, and the angle of a head bent over a book. No alarm rose. The building allowed no alarm right then. She unlocked the door and stepped back into the reading room. The figure turned a page. The lamps hummed. The chair creaked. She approached. The chair across from the reader was pulled out just enough to suggest permission. The book on the table was The Listening Room. It lay open to the last chapter. The page had an extra paragraph in the exact typeface of the older pages. The words landed in her like things you remember. They said, "When the house has given you its quiet, leave it something to keep. It will return. What is owed when you need it, and it will ask you to carry what it cannot carry alone. Mara Saturday," she read. Her eyes traced the loops of type she had been reading all evening, and yet they felt new, and yet they felt older than the keys on her lanyard. When she lifted her head, the chair across from her was no longer occupied. A draft moved her hair. She felt like whispering thank you again, as if she had been given a cup of water in a desert without having realized she was thirsty. On her way out, the door opened onto the vestibule as it should. She locked the building and stepped into the square. The courthouse clock chose a time and held it. The air smelled rinsed. She turned to look back at the library. The windows looked like old eyes that had watched children turn into adults and then come back with their children. She wanted to touch the stone, so she did. It was cool under her palm and steady. The next morning she arrived early. The town woke around her in its usual way. Delivery trucks, a cyclist with a scarf, a woman with a small dog who enjoyed the dignity of a bow tie. She let herself into the library. The book was not on the cart. The card catalog's middle drawer was closed. On the desk lay a small envelope. It was cream, the same paper as the call card, with her name in that same old-hand script. Inside was a single blank card and a short note. "Keep this," the note said, "in case you hear someone who needs to borrow the quiet." Unsigned, and yet signed precisely by its existence. For a while, she did not tell anyone. Some things are so precise that even telling changes them. She noticed new details in the building now. She heard the almost laughter of pages when a child discovered the right book for the first time. She saw how a man's shoulders lowered when he sat down at a table that had been waiting for him to carry less. She learned how to stand in exactly the right place and hum 3 notes, so the sound moved along the atlas case and up the staircase to the second-floor balcony, where it stitched itself to the metal like a small, useful seam. If there were other calls, they were all really the same one. People came to the desk and did not know how to ask for what they needed, so they asked for something else, and Mara listened past their words. Sometimes she slid a book across that seemed unrelated. The world reached for itself and found a way to connect. Once, on a capsized day when nothing felt as it had when she woke, she opened the card catalog and found a card with her name written faintly and a date 2 weeks in the future. She did not pull it. She let it wait. When 2 weeks passed, it darkened to certainty all on its own. There was one other thing. Now and then, late on Tuesdays, the return slot clicked, and the soft thud echoed, and there would be a book or a pamphlet from no one and everyone. They all had a common thread, the way a melody can hide in different songs. The library was a listening room, and it returned what was owed. Once it returned laughter to a chair where someone had cried the week before. Once it returned a folded piece of paper, blank but warm, that a child took and promptly used to draw exactly the picture required to get that afternoon safely to bedtime. In the staff room, someone had pinned a grainy black and white photo of the library from the year it opened. People stood on the steps in hats, tidy with civic pride. A handwritten note along the bottom edge said, "Keepers." The hand was the same as the one on the cards. It felt like someone on the other side of time had handed a thread of twine and asked it to be held for a while. The building asked to be kept the way it remembered itself. Mara said yes. In the ordinary way, a person says yes to a job and then finds out a different set of tasks lives underneath the list. On Tuesdays, when she set the lamps, she let their light overlap just so. On some nights, the clock above the door skipped a tick and caught up without being asked. And sometimes, for reasons so good they made her throat warm, the return slot clicked and a book came home through the only door it knew. Story number 2. On the edge of town where the water tower stamped its silhouette against the sky, the AM station sat in a low brick building with a single red light that stayed on through the night. The lobby had a soda machine that hummed like a sleeping animal. A hallway led to the studio, where a glass window held a square of dark, and beyond it the board glowed with small constellations. The on-air sign made a steady red that felt warmer than it should. Outside, the two towers blinked in a rhythm that truckers knew without looking. A slow, patient beat meant to be noticed without asking for attention. Mina worked the overnight shift when someone called in sick. She knew the board and the software and the way AM sound behaved like weather, carrying farther on cold fall nights and folding back on itself in summer heat. She liked the small circle of light in the studio, the way her coffee steamed a little too fast under the vent, and the feeling of steering a ship most people forgot existed after midnight. The playlist was quiet. Standards, late requests, a few local announcements. Between songs, she read time and temperature in that careful cadence that belonged to stations with long histories and letters painted on the wall in a font that had outlived fashions. The station's phone lines had personality. The request line rang with a bell that sounded older than any phone company would admit. The newsroom line had a sharper burr. The backdoor buzzer had its own wire and cut through everything like an opinion. That night, a front was coming through. The wind made the towers sing as if a bottle had been blown across the top. The engineer, usually on call, had left a note. Mild drift on the board. Watch the compressor. Make sure the delay is armed. The delay lived under the console, a sturdy gray box with a tiny screen that counted the seconds between the room and the air. 7 seconds were there to protect from accidents. The red numbers sat in a neat row. 7. Mina checked them the way some people check locks. At 12:08, the request line jingled. She took it and dropped her voice to that friendly nighttime shape. The caller didn't ask for a song. A woman's voice, older, soft, said Mina's name as if it were written on something nearby. Then, "Don't let cart 3 roll at 12:11. The woman's tone wasn't a warning. It was like someone asking her to cover a pot so the pasta didn't boil over. Before Mina could ask who it was, the line clicked, polite as a librarian closing a book. Cart 3 wasn't a cart anymore. It was a virtual has-been. In the software that old-timers still called carts, PSA about morning street cleaning, it was set to fire as a courtesy fill at 12:11 in case the headlines ran short. She hadn't looked. She moved the mouse, unlit the trigger. At 12:11, the weatherbed ended on beat. Silence that wasn't silence held for a breath. Then the next track floated up exactly where she'd planned. The sense of having avoided a small, stupid tangle felt like a hand straightening a picture in a hallway. She told herself some listener could have guessed or worked here once. She kept the board exactly where she wanted it. The wind pressed its palm against the windows and then released. A poster in the hallway lifted at the corner, then settled. The towers blinked. At 12:38, the newsroom line rang. Nobody used it overnight unless it was the sheriff's office or a fire captain with a brush warning. Mina picked up and said the station letters without thinking. This time, a man spoke as if reading from a very short script. "Switch your transmitter at 109. Don't wait for the pop." The voice was low and unhurried, without breath noise, as if the world had learned to speak when no one else was around. She opened her mouth to ask for a callback number. The line went neutral and stayed that way. The main transmitter was a boxy beast out in the metal-sided shed by the towers. The backup sat next to it like a sturdy cousin. The switch lived on the wall by the meter, a lever with more authority than its small size suggested. There wasn't a reason to prefer the backup unless the main got hot in a voltage dip. Nothing in the logs predicted trouble. She could hear the old engineer in her head. "Don't baby it. Let the gear work." She marked, of the time anyway. She made her voice easy over the next intro, took weather from the wire, and let a piano drift out into the county. At 107, the request line jingled a single ring, something the old phone liked to do when a storm scraped the lines. At 109, the air in the studio changed in a way she never would have noticed any other night. It was small, like a new word in a paragraph. The meters on the board kept their calm sway. The gray delay box held it 7 seconds without comment. But somewhere in the walls, a sound that usually lived below hearing decided to step up into the room for just an instant, a sort of clearing of a throat in a church. She stood. The hallway smelled faintly of dust that had been disturbed, and then coaxed back down. She turned the corner to the back door, keyed it, stepped into the dark between building and shed, and felt the evening pushing against everything. Her flashlight made a cone that found the padlock and the handle and the switch panel inside. The main meter showed normal. The backup's green ready light had a tiny, intermittent tremble. Not a failure, a suggestion. She put her hand on the lever. Her skin prickled with that sense people get when a room requires a decision. She moved the lever with a careful, uninterrupted action the way she had been taught. Steady, no show, no flinch. Back in the studio, the sound was the same, which is to say it was not. The backup felt like a different road to the same house. In her headphones, the hiss at the edges of silence had shifted tone, a winter sound instead of a summer one. Saturday. The on-air sign made its quiet red the way it had since before she was born. At 1:13, a tone slid under the playlist for a breath. A single high thread that didn't belong to the music. It vanished. The newsroom line rang, one ring, and the sheriff's voice, friendly and brisk, came through. "Heads up east of the bypass. Controlled burn got lively. We're on it." She logged it. The words arrived without heat. On another night, they would have felt like nothing at all. She didn't talk to listeners about any of it. She played a request from a long-haul friend who liked a particular guitar solo to accompany the stretch between mile markers. The request itself had come at 11. Ordinary and cheerful. She cued it where it would meet the highway at a place that felt right. The keepers of small rooms know the difference between schedule and timing, and she had learned to trust that. At 1:20, the request line rang again. The woman from before thanked her for the careful transition. Mina felt the room notice the compliment. Then the woman said, "Prop the lobby door before 103. Another line. The newsroom line now." Low voice. No name. An almost smile in it. "Don't stand under the return vent at the top of the hour." The voice and the woman sounded like different people, but they shared something Mina couldn't name. A music between sentences that felt like the station itself had learned how to speak through them. 103 came and went. The lobby door had a closer that liked to pull hard, and a pane that sang if it hit just right. Mina wedged a rubber doorstop against it with the graceful, everyday movement of someone doing a task without making it a task. At 105, air from the front pulled a poster off its pushpins in the hallway, an old county fair ad that had lived on the wall too long. It slid down, made a soft noise, and shivered to a stop against the prop door instead of slapping the glass into sound that would have been on the air between songs. There was a binder in the rack by the tower remote, Skip and Scatter Nights. The cover had a coffee ring older than Mina. Inside, pages meant for meter readings had tiny notes along the margins in engineer handwriting, lightning and leading, They'd written once, like a joke with itself. Another line. When the layer is right, the station hears back what it's about to do. The next page had a date and, more quietly, a time, 1:13, nothing else. The pen had pressed more in that one number. She turned the page. Someone had drawn a small diagram of the layers above the earth, and how AM rides them like a finger on glass. A different hand had written, "Callers don't always call from where. Sometimes they call from when. Use them. They're listening to us too." The overnight engineer who had written that had been gone years moved to a bigger market. Still, Mina felt like she'd been handed a well-worn tool that fit her palm. She stopped looking for explanations and kept time instead. The phone rang as if it had been taught the rhythm. A request landed exactly a song ahead of itself. A farmer called to say the wind had shifted 10 minutes before the official report did. The weather radio tested itself an hour early with a voice that felt like a rehearsal. Near two, the paper towel dispenser in the little studio bathroom coughed and gave up a fold, the way machines sometimes do when they're thinking. She stopped thinking of the voices as strangers. They felt like caretakers from other pages of the log, like people who had sat in the spinny chair at the board long enough to grow a habit of caution that sounded like kindness. They spoke as if the station were a person they liked. The only time fear got a foothold was at 1:57, just before the hour. The delay box under the console bled a second, and then gathered it back sharply, the numbers hopping from 6.3 to 7, as if someone had tugged a ribbon and let it go. Her headphones filled with an absence that had shape, a breath. The man's voice came through without the phone ringing, not in her headphones. In the room, under the song. "Don't step into the lobby at 2. Wait 30 seconds. She didn't turn. She kept her hands on the faders like someone balancing a tray. The song ended with a long, pretty chord. The ID rolled. The weatherbed came in soft. At 2, she stayed exactly where she was. A ceiling tile in the lobby that had never complained chose that moment to surrender a corner. It flopped down, hit air on the way, and settled on the grab mat with a sound like a deck of cards being released. No drama, no mess, just a small thing happening somewhere else. At 2:01, a different call came in. This time, a familiar voice with a little laugh. Her morning show partner, who would not be awake for another 2 hours, asking her if she wanted anything from the coffee place on her way in. She almost said, "Who told you to ask now?" Instead, she said, "Surprise me." The partner chuckled, like someone who had heard a good story from the future and was trying not to reveal the punchline. Near dawn, the tower's lights seemed to lose their red and gain their ordinary. The hum of the building made room for the day in a way a house does when people start moving differently. The binder by the tower remote held a blank line at the end of its last page. Mina took a pen and wrote without fuss. "If the station feels like it's listening back, let it. Switch before the pop. Prop the door before 1:03. Don't stand under the vent at the top of the hour when the wind sings through the guy wires." And then, smaller, a time, 1:13. She signed with initials that meant little to anyone but the file cabinet. Then she tucked the binder back, exactly where it had been. When she stepped outside, the air had that early light where the horizon doesn't know yet which color to be. Somewhere a truck clicked its blinker as if it were thinking. The station behind her went on being itself letters painted on the wall. A red light that had watched years turn into more years. A delay box that usually held 7 seconds, but sometimes, on nights when the sky had opinions, seemed to lean forward instead of back. The request line rang once. Just a chime. The sort a phone makes when a call arrives and thinks better of it. The little screen showed the station's own number, as if the building had called itself at the wrong time and found no one at the desk to answer. The ring faded into the morning. Mina locked the door and watched her breath disappear into the same air that used to carry baseball games and election returns, and long ago dedications across fields and into kitchens and into the cabs of trucks that had more faith in red. Lights on dark towers than in the noise of any city. She would work other nights. Sometimes nothing happened, but song after song in a quiet that felt clean. Sometimes the wind or the season or the way the clouds arranged themselves over the county turned the station into a place where time learned to be helpful. Those nights, the phones rang when they needed to. The voices didn't ask for anything that would cost anyone. They borrowed attention and paid it back in small, exact moments. A poster, catching on a doorstop. A lever moved before something strained. A song arriving on a stretch of highway exactly when a driver needed the world to behave like it had been listening. Story number 3. The tower at Harbor and Fifth had 40 floors on paper and 39 buttons in its elevators. 12 went straight to 14, the way buildings sometimes skip a number as if skipping a thought. Night crews knew the place better than the brochures did. They knew which doors stuck in winter and which stairwells breathed on windy nights. And they knew the service elevator was older than the others because it hummed in a lower key. B started at 10 and finished at 6. She liked the shift because the city softened and the building felt like a lantern left on a porch. Her cart rattled a little until she found that if she tucked the spray bottles in diagonally, the noise dissolved. The inspection certificate behind the elevator glass was always 1 day from expiring and always current, a little joke from the maintenance company, probably. The panel lit cleanly. Lobby through 12. Then 14 up to 40, and a key switch labeled Fire Service that she was trained never to touch unless told. The first odd thing was small. A Tuesday, windy enough to make the awnings talk. She pressed 21. The doors closed with the steady, bureaucratic grace of a machine that had learned not to startle anyone. As it rose past 12, the little amber numbers ticked to 13 for the span of a blink. The chime did not sound. Then 14, 15, and up as expected. A glitch, she thought, but the next time, she noticed the faintness of it, as if the 13 were there under the panel like an old sticker under new paint. That week, the elevator began offering courtesies. Doors that needed an elbow earlier in the night opened before she reached them if she was carrying bags. When she forgot a dustpan on 8, the car stopped there on its own while she was reaching for 18. She took it as a kindness of timing, the way some days the light turns green exactly when you arrive at the crosswalk. On Friday, she found a paper tucked behind the emergency phone in the elevator. It was a torn corner from a memo with a letterhead the building no longer used. The kind of serif you only see in old manuals. Written in tidy pen, "Please do not exit on the floor that remembers you." She stared at it, smiled despite herself, and tucked it into the pocket of her jacket. A joke from day shift? A note that drifted? The pocket warmed where the paper rested as she worked. B had met Leon, the night guard, over bad coffee and the map of the fire stairs. He had the relaxed caution of someone who had worked nights long enough to believe in patterns without needing to explain them. When she mentioned the momentary 13, he didn't do what most people do and tell her about the way numbers work in buildings. He said lightly, like telling weather, "If you ever get the doors on a floor that looks like the building hasn't learned its own fixtures yet, just wait. The car knows what to do." Far after midnight, the building settled into itself so fully that the city might as well have stepped back and let it be. She loaded a bag from 19, pressed 14 so she could use the supply closet, and watched the numbers. 12, 13, it held. The chime sounded, a soft tone that did not match the others. The doors parted on a corridor Bia had never seen. The carpet was familiar but wrong. The same pattern of little stars, faded to a softer blue. The exit signs had a gentler font. The air smelled like paper that had spent a long time near sunlight, and then had been moved. Down the hall a light flickered, not in the sloppy way of a dying bulb but in a thinking way, as if deciding how bright to be. She did not move a foot. Her hands found the bar of her cart and stayed there. She thought she heard a cart like her own, the wheels making that soft apology some carts make when asked to turn before they want to. The radio on her hip hissed with a bare thread of sound, not enough to be speech. She touched the push to talk, and then didn't. The elevator's doors held open longer than any OSHA rule would require. She saw the reflection in the polished steel herself, the cart, and behind her a water cooler with a paper cone dispenser they had replaced 2 summers ago. Her reflection blinked. The water in the reflection's jug made a ripple. Here, in the car, nothing moved but air. "Let it close," Leon said, his voice in her radio, calm in the way people mean calm. He didn't ask where she was. The doors listened to the sentence. They swept in, joined softly, and the car lifted. 14 arrived with the fluorescent that sometimes hummed. The supply closet was itself, a dignified mess of spare liners and a mop that had somehow bent in 2 directions at once. B stood for a long second, felt the stamps of her shoes on the rubber floor of the car, and waited for her breathing to remember it had a job. Back in the lobby later, she perched on the edge of the security desk while Leon paged through the dog-eared binder that lived there. Old notes, and newer notes. With an attitude of inheritance. A blueprint curled at the corners showed a page from when the building had been smaller. Between 12 and 14 was a level labeled Mech Switch. Phones, Leon said. Once upon a time. They say there were offices for a month, and then nobody wanted mail with that number in it. They changed the signs and changed their minds. The space kept being the space. What if I had stepped out? V asked, before she could decide to laugh it off. Leon looked at the glass door to the street, then back. You would have stepped into a hallway that behaved. Then you would have gotten back on the car. Because you're good at listening. The next time the number flickered, she treated it like a corner of a rug she would not lift. The elevator kept up its courtesies. It lingered when she was almost to it. It carried her cart as if it had thoughts about balance. Once, as she pushed out onto 31 with a sack of shredded paper, she found a glove she'd lost in January parked neatly on the threshold. The elevator fan stirred her hair. She held the glove, looked up at the panel, and said softly, "Thanks." On a night scheduled for alarm testing, the fire panel painted the lobby red with its ideas. The elevator went into a mode she had trained for. Keyed control, doors opening and closing only when asked. She stood in the car with the control panel live, and felt responsible in a way she liked. In the small rectangular display where a capital L usually glowed for lobby, a thin 13 appeared, faint as a watermark. A hall call pinged that should not exist. She watched it without reacting. She pressed 12, then 14. The way the training said when a call won't clear. Lead it around the bend. The 13 pulsed, then rested, as if the building had nodded. Later, coming down for her break, she noticed the certificate behind the glass. The date hadn't changed, but a name had been written in fine print along the bottom, as if it had always been there. B. Santos Night Inspection. The frames of her eyes tightened, and then softened again. Maybe someone in maintenance was being kind. Maybe the building had a tidiness streak. Near dawn, when light began laying itself across the marble, she made one last trip to 7 to empty a bin. The ride down was steady. Past 12, the panel glowed 13, and held just long enough to make room for a single chime. The doors did not open. The car went on to lobby. When they parted, a folded paper sat where the threshold kisses the hall. She picked it up. A memo corner with the same letterhead, neater writing this time, as if someone had found their glasses. "Thank you for not stepping out," it said. Another line beneath. "If a floor remembers you, it will remember your good choices, too." She slipped the paper into her pocket with the other. Outside, the street had turned back into a place where buses belonged and a barista considered pastry. And nobody thought about the spaces between 12 and 14 because numbers do not hold the only maps. B locked the custodial closet, rolled her cart back to its corner, and paused by the elevator. She pressed the call button without needing to. The bell answered with that new, soft tone. "Good night," she said to the closed doors. The display flickered. Instead of a number, for a breath, the building's logo appeared, the little lighthouse shape embedded in the letterhead of every tenant memo. Then the car took a breath of its own and was quiet. Story number 4. The Lost Articles office waited under the city like a quiet pocket in a coat. Its window faced a corridor tiled in white and green, where late trains breathed damp air into the night. A bell above the office door rang in a voice older than the station, a thin, tidy chime that never startled and never failed. Shelves along the back wall held umbrellas like well-behaved birds. A rolling cage held backpacks that had decided for a time not to follow their owners. The counter had a burnished strip where coins had traveled for decades. A brass chute labeled "Drop" accepted whatever the tunnels returned after midnight. It thunked with authority and then purred, as if thinking about what it had swallowed. Imani worked nights because she liked the underside of the city. The colors were truer in low light. The announcements lost their daytime impatience and came out sounding like advice. "You are arriving," they said. "Pay attention here." Somewhere farther down the hall, a cleaning crew moved in a choreography of wheels and squeegees. A map on the wall had a sun-faded edge, where a window had once let in daylight before a renovation sealed it away. The clock over the door gained 2 minutes and then remembered them. She logged each item by hand in a ledger whose paper had bitten edges. The computer also wanted its fields. But the ledger carried the authority of pencil and habit. Tonight's first thing was a scarf that smelled faintly of oranges. It came through the chute with a civil thump. The tag, a thin card threaded to one corner with cotton string, already knew more than she did. It said, Platform 3 bench, left end, 217, please do not wash. The handwriting wasn't hers, wasn't anyone she recognized, and yet in its neatness, the station itself felt present. The way it can in those moments when nobody else is around and it remembers its own age. Imani had been told, on her first night by a supervisor who believed in rules and also in superstitions, that the office sometimes returned things by its own route. If a tag told her what to do, she could follow it. If it didn't, the bins waited until morning and became someone else's responsibility. It seemed generous to let the night decide for itself small matters of reunion. At 2:17, she left the scarf on the left end of the bench on platform 3, while the cameras blinked their red eyes in the concrete. The platform was nearly empty. A woman stood by the pillar with her hands in her coat, staring at the little window of black where the tunnel mouth would admit a train. She had the posture of someone arguing with herself. When the system's voice announced the arrival of a train 2 stops away, the woman turned like a weather vane. The scarf, in its casual dignity, caught her eye. She lifted it the way you lift a found sentence, draped it over her shoulders, and took a breath that seemed to change the next hour of her life. The train doors opened. She let them close. Imani walked back to the office and made a note, not in any official box. Left bench, saved one decision. At 1:30, a single shoe came down the chute. Small, canvas, stamped with stars. Chalk powder ghosted its rubber toe. The tag read, Keep chalk. Do not match a pair. Window shelf 35. She set it on the shelf by the glass where commuters set forms when pens won't work. At 3:05 exactly, a man with a child on his hip came to the window, the child's other shoe dangling, its laces a stubborn knot. The chalk on the office shoe made the man smile with the surprise he had needed. We've been looking for the map, he said to nobody, and placed the child's shoe next to its twin. The chalk dust transferred. A city drawn earlier on a sidewalk somewhere else reappeared and taught small feet which way to go. They left both shoes and took one. Imani wiped her finger across the counter and left a light comet of chalk. Some nights, the chute returned keys. Old keys like questions. One clattered onto the felt pad beneath the opening, brass worn to a softness that meant years in a pocket. It bore a stamped code, B12. The tag, Do not open locker. Set key on counter 13. Let it be seen. The clocks rarely worked together, but the platform indicator outside the office blinked 13, as if it had agreed to. Imani set the key under the window. She polished the glass just by breathing on it. In the reflection of the key, the stamp reversed itself and, in that reversal, showed letters not present on the metal. A name she knew from the morning news. Someone who had gone to the wrong train and come back 2 weeks later having changed jobs. The printer by the computer, the one that sulked if fed the wrong paper, warmed and printed a claim ticket with that name. A minute later, a hand appeared at the window without a face above it, sliding the claim under the glass with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this exact motion elsewhere. The hand collected the key. The bell over the door made its calm announcement, even though the door had not opened. Imani did not tell anyone about the pauses the station took between announcements, where it felt like listening more than speaking. On the busiest days, the system voice chased itself, overlapping its own sentences. But at night, the voice set each word down neatly, as a librarian sets down a volume. Mind the gap, it would say, holding a note longer than usual like a human being might when they were thinking of a person in particular. Her only rule was this: do not open what is not yours. When a suitcase came down without a claim, she did not lift its lid. She logged its description. This one was sea green, with a sticker from a lake 2 states away. The tag had an instruction in a different hand than the others. Bolder, more sure. Upper mezzanine, bench between maps, 312. Not for opening, for returning, for you. Her name followed, written with care, as if letters were a promise that could take weight. She looked up at the curved glass of the office window. Her reflection looked back like someone who'd found a step between floors. For you could mean many things. For you could be a trap, if the world were cruel. But the office had so far shown the sort of manners the best rooms do. She rolled the suitcase to the mezzanine. It was the part of the station that seemed built for goodbyes that people meant, and goodbyes they didn't. Two maps faced each other on the walls like two opinions that had decided to get along. At 3:12, the intercom popped with a delicate sound, a bubble of attention. The announcement repeated a train number from a schedule that wasn't tonight's. She sat on the bench and set the suitcase beside her. When the sound softened, she read the smaller letters printed beneath the instruction on the tag. Do not keep, accept, then return. She rested a hand on the suitcase and felt it warm, like a sleeping dog that recognizes a footstep. She left it there and listened to the station breathe. A cleaning cart took the long way around a pillar. A group of teenagers passed, the quiet, sticky togetherness of the late hour holding them close. A shoe squeaked in the tunnel mouth in the small, human way shoes do when they're making plans. Then a woman stepped out from the shadow by the staircase. She carried a folded paper like a map she wasn't sure was oriented correctly. When she saw the suitcase, hope decided to inhabit her shoulders again. In the office window below, the printer spun a claim ticket into the tray. Imani did not need to see it to know it would have the right name. The woman's hands shook with that particular relief that belongs to people who find exactly the thing they need at exactly the moment when they had prepared to do without. They nodded to each other, a private seam stitched in public, and the woman rolled the suitcase toward the escalator. Imani followed at a distance, not because she doubted, but because sometimes the station liked witnesses. Back at the desk, the ledger waited. She wrote with her neat, practical script, all facts. Then, in the margin, a quieter line. Returned by route unknown. Above the counter, cameras showed images that belonged to the present. On the top left monitor, for a breath, the office saw itself reflected back like a room caught between blink and blink. In that moment, the bell over the door rang once. An economy of acknowledgement. Near 4, the last train made a sound like a long thought exhaled. The city's surface began thinking about morning. A final thing came through the chute. Not a coat. Not a key. A little tin labeled, buttons kept. The lid held a paper circle under it, handwritten in a hand Imani did know. Her grandmother's, borrowed from an old recipe, the R's shaped like threads. Keep the one that matches nothing, it said. Give the rest to the window. She opened the tin and found a jumble of shapes, different years touching. One button was translucent amber, with a tiny flaw, like a caught bubble. It matched nothing. She kept it in the pocket with her ID and felt the weight of a small truth that no longer asked to be heavier. She placed the tin on the counter and slid open the window. The night took the buttons with the same respect it had shown a scarf and a shoe and a key, distributing them into the city the way it knows how, along sleeves, onto coats, into little drawers where people would find them when something needed holding. When her shift ended, the office smelled like concrete and clean paper, and a faint whisper of oranges. The chute's edges glowed very slightly, the way some metals do when they've been handled kindly. Imani flipped the closed sign to open, because the day crew liked to find optimism waiting. On her way out, the announcement voice said her name as if it were reading it from a list of stations. Then, please mind the gap. Not between train and platform, she thought, between losing and being returned. Story number 5. After hours, the museum let out a breath it held all day. Air settled into its glass ribs. The security lights dimmed to a color that made everything look 1 century older. In the north wing, a winter scene held its temperature, the way a secret keeps a tone. Evergreen boughs iced with painted frost, snow that was never cold, but never warm either, and a sky that had been brushed by an artist who taught himself to blur time. Nora worked maintenance for the dioramas. She checked hygrometers and swapped bulbs and touched up chips with a brush the size of a match. Her favorite part was the lighting board. It lived in a nook behind the prairie case, an old console with sliders labeled Dusk, Stars, Moon 1, Moon 2, and a button someone had taped an extra label over. Storm, please be gentle. She knew each cue by heart. The coyote in the desert scene looked best with moon 2 at 15%. The aviary liked a warmer dawn. The mammoth's hair read too red if she wasn't careful. On a Tuesday, the kind of quiet night that made your ears feel larger, she ran the star sequence for a school program the next morning. The painted ceiling above the prairie darkened to the exact blue families imagine when they say the word night. Tiny pinholes breathed out stars. She was counting along 1, 2, 3. Pause when she saw a point of light slow blink where no pinhole lived. It wasn't bright enough to be a reflection. It simply joined the set, as if the painted sky had remembered an old detail and wanted to return it. She walked the perimeter and checked the blinds. No leak of streetlight slipped through. The display glass, 30 feet long and heavier than a decision, held true. When she returned to the board, a piece of paper waited under the faders where none had been. Museum letterhead, the previous logo, with its serifed M. Typed in faint black from a machine the museum had retired years ago. Do not open the prairie glass at 1:27. Let the room keep its weather. She looked at her phone. 12:49. The doors behind the exhibits had a way of sounding like they were changing their minds. Tonight, the service door to the mammoth scene gave a soft half-click and then steadied. She took her break early, sat on the bench beside the velvet rope, and listened to the museum speak the way big buildings speak when they are deciding how to rest. The HVAC whispered a long, even word. The exit signs hummed a single note. At 1:27, because she had nothing to prove, she stood by the prairie case and didn't touch its latch. The hinges hid in the wooden frame, like polished bones. It was an old piece of craftsmanship. It could bite a hand that got clever. As the minute turned, the glass gave a tidy flex, the kind windows make when a pressure change asks a question. It would have been just enough to snap an unwary latch into being not quite itself for the rest of the year. Then the flex eased. The star that had not been a real star winked once more and went quiet, as if a door had slid shut somewhere beyond the painted horizon. She wrote it in the binder the night crew used for messages that didn't belong on work orders. Under Tuesday, she wrote, "Advice from nowhere waited. Glass held. Recalibrate humidity in the morning." Leon from security would see it and nod like a person who believed less in explanations than in good behavior. Work asks you to move, and the night asks you to wait, and Nora was good at both. She threaded her way behind the diorama walls to the aviary. The fake trees there had seen more real life than some parks. The recorded bird songs, set to a volume that respected ears, trilled according to a pattern studied by someone with patience and good boots. She listened. Tonight, amid the usual morning chatter, the tape never played at night. A single call landed 3 notes, a beat, 1 more note. She had heard it once, on a spring hike. White-throated sparrow. The tape didn't have it. On the narrow shelf behind the scene where she kept spare bulbs, a folded label sat like a waiting tooth. The museum had used that stock for decades. Thin, opaque, slightly glossy. Someone, or some machine that learned to behave like one, had typed her name and a time. 2:4, closed the roof panel above the mountain goats. She glanced at the ceiling. A translucent pane cut the high darkness into gentle angles. Tonight the glass had fogged in a way that meant the outside air had opinions. She took the long stair up to the roofline and eased the panel shut until the latch kissed. 2 minutes later, a wind shouldered the skylights. Dust that lived contentedly where it lived would have tumbled into the goat's crags if the panel had been open. She put her palm flat to the seam and felt the museum say thank you without words. Back at ground, she noticed the small things that meant the building was awake differently. A reflection held longer than the glass that made it. A painted fern seemed a shade greener. She wasn't the first to notice. In the staff hallway, behind emergency supplies in a metal cabinet, a page from 1976 waited under a magnet. Handwriting neat as a surveyor's. If the night gives instructions, that's still the museum. It's just the page under the page. At 219, the service corridor between the prehistoric gallery and the marine hall grew 3 steps longer. It did that sometimes. No trick of eyes, her key loop counted out the distance in the way it tugged at her hip. The far red exit sign brightened like a lighthouse. She was halfway down when a door she hadn't meant to open cracked at its frame. Not enough to invite, enough to suggest. The air from inside was colder by exactly the temperature of a lake in November. She could have leaned, could have told herself she was just checking the seal. Instead, she stood still and watched her breath happen in the corridor and not beyond. The crack widened the width of a pencil, and then drew itself back, patient as a cat deciding not to bother with a mouse. She walked on. The exit sign returned to its ordinary red, with an almost sigh. She had one more task, replacing a tiny bulb in a case that held schoolchildren's drawings from decades of field trips. The museum rotated them every so often. It was a good exhibit, the kind that reminded you that people had always drawn the same mammoth with the same eager curves. On the floor beside the pedestal lay a sketchbook, spiral-bound, cover dinged with use. She picked it up to put it in the office. A tag stuck to the back scraped her palm. Return to Fossil Hall bench, 244. Do not look inside. Her job had taught her that not peeking is a kind of love. She delivered it, set it on the bench as if it had decided to nap there, and moved 2 paces away. A minute later, the night made room for a visitor. Not a person she could tell the difference between footsteps that belonged and footsteps the museum made in its sleep. More like the shape of someone who had been here earlier and who would come again in the morning, tugged into the corner of now just long enough to meet a book in the right place. The air around the bench had that charged stillness a room has when someone remembers something in it. The book was not there when Nora walked past again. She didn't need to check the camera. She knew. Only once did the museum ask for something that made her throat go tight. She had to open the desert case to adjust a timer. The latch clicked sure, the way it always did. And she stepped into the thin space that exists between exhibit and glass where floor paint is scuffed by curator's shoes and a box of gels sits like a lunch. Inside that small world, the coyote's painted shadow ear caught her eye. It pointed in a direction that made no sense. A painted shadow of an ear shouldn't point anywhere. She followed its angle to a scrap of label stock tucked in the flat stone the coyote stood on. Do not put your foot on the scene, it said. Not tonight. She realized her weight had shifted toward the mistake every tech makes once. She leaned back, took a breath, and felt the room relax, like a friend who has watched your ankle at the edge of a curb. When she closed up, she wrote a quiet addendum in the binder. Some of us are here to keep dust off things, some to keep time around them. Let's help each other. She added the times the notes had given. It looked like a poem without trying. Toward 5, the building began to think in day again. The soft machines woke. The cafe grinders learned their vowel. A lint moted in the first strip of window light. Like a choreographed snowfall, Nora took one last walk past the prairie. The unlisted star did not shine now. But in the painted cabin on the far horizon, a detail she had always admired, the small square of a window glowed the faintest degree more than any painter could have designed. Perhaps that was a trick of human eyes in early light. Perhaps not. She stopped by the label drawer to restock. On top sat a single card, already typed, with a name she didn't know, and a time tomorrow afternoon. She placed it where it would be found by a docent who would spend exactly the right extra minute with a group who didn't know they needed it. In her pocket, her phone showed 5:27. She felt the leftover warmth of the roof panel handle, the cool memory of the service corridor, and the soft weight of a night that had made itself useful without ever once pretending to be anything other than what it was. A building full of scenes that had learned to keep their own weather until someone kind came by to help. On her way out, she passed the planetarium doors. The poster case had a star map printed for the month. In the corner, a tiny sticker had been placed clear, almost invisible unless you were looking, marking a star just off the chart. It looked exactly like the one that had blinked into the painted sky. Below, in handwriting she recognized from the old note on the staff cabinet. Extra. The museum had decided to keep one. Story number 6. The lookout tower stood at the end of a narrow ridge, its stilts sunk into bedrock like careful thought. By day it watched 100 miles of timber and sage and old burns that had grown soft with grasses. By night it kept the sky close, windows catching constellations and the slow ghost of the Milky Way drifting between lightning scars on the glass. The stairs creaked in a language that belonged to the building and the wind. June kept the night shift during red flag weeks. She liked the work because it had rules, and because the rules were older than she was. Check the horizon every quarter hour. Sweep the ring of the Osborne firefinder in a slow circle. Note the air's weight on the barometer, the style of the wind. Call in smoke if smoke is smoke, not dust, not wishful thinking. The logbook waited on the desk like a neighbor willing to listen. The radio sat quiet unless spoken to. A magnetophone lived on the wall beside it, a crank-handled thing that connected to a line strung along the ridge long before cell service tried and failed to reach this high. Sometimes she spun the crank lightly, enjoying the neat whir. The glass insulators on the pole outside caught moonlight in pale knots. Her first week, the mountain taught her its small clockwork. At midnight, the canyon to the east offered a sound like a distant train. No tracks were anywhere near. At 1, the owls worked the edge of the meadow below. At 2, the wind shifted a degree down. And at 3, the lake far off to the north released a sigh into the sky that you could feel more than hear. The first odd thing was not odd enough to say aloud. A thin thread of lighter dark lifted from a notch in the south range. It looked like smoke if she were irresponsible. It looked like a trick of night if she were cautious. She lined up the firefinder, set the hairline of the sight on a particular snag on a shoulder of mountain she knew like a face, and read the azimuth, 138 degrees. The pencil on the desk lay where she'd left it, but a second pencil she didn't own rested beside it, shaved to a squid leg point, older wood, different paint. In looping, tidy letters, the azimuth was already written in the margin of the log, with the time next to it and a question mark that looked more like a parenthesis. 138. 037 keep. June stood very still. She had the ordinary explanations ready. Another lookout might have called base. Base might have typed. A printout might have curled onto her desk while she was checking the catwalk. A stray breeze might have turned the page and made it look like the words had been waiting. She flipped back to the last entries and found, a week ago, a set of neat numerals that matched the pen, not the pencil. Same hand? No. The ink had filled the paper fibers differently. She rubbed her thumb over the graphite. It smudged the way pencil does when it is fresh, and when it is not fresh, both. Because pencil does not age the way ink does. The mountain ringed itself in small sounds. A night bird made a triangle of notes. June lifted the phone receiver and put it back down. The radio woke briefly as base checked wind. NW at 5, she said, and her voice sounded normal, like someone who could tell a dust devil from a promise. At 044, the magnetophone clicked once all by itself, not a ring. A polite clear of the throat. June put her hand on the crank, and then carefully did nothing. The click came again, then a whisper of current. She lifted the receiver and listened. The line held the valley's hush, then a woman's voice, older, steady, the sort of voice that owns a thermos and a patience, said June's name with the stress on the second syllable the way people downriver said it. Don't stand on the west catwalk at 1-3, the voice added, not a warning tone, just the tone you use when telling someone to take a pot holder for a hot lid. Then the line went soft and lay down like a dog that had been called away gently. She might have laughed another night. This one she wrote it down. 045 call. On pack line advice, catwalk 1-3. The logbook accepted the sentence without judgment. She checked the horizon. The lighter dark had sunk back into the notch. The stars did what stars do. At 1-3, the tower breathed in the smallest of measures. A gust ran along the ridge and changed its mind at the last instant. A loose head of a roofing nail flickered, then chose not to release. The west catwalk flexed, as wood does when reminded it is wood. June was on the east side, with the binoculars on their hook, and a single moth swept past her ear. A curve of dusty, indifferent grace. She told herself nothing had happened, but the way the tower relaxed, she knew something had not happened that could have been a distraction later. The next night, the voice on the phone waited until June put the kettle on. 211, tap the barometer twice, the voice said. June tapped once, gently, and the needle hesitated between two truths. She tapped again, no harder, and the needle committed. The number it chose made her reach for the radio. A drop like that meant the far peaks might hide a change. Base listened, thoughtful. A volunteer crew down in the valley adjusted plans that had been penciled too near the afternoon. June asked who she was speaking to, and the line gave her a smile without words. Then a name came in the quiet. Addie, the voice said. as if confirming something June had already heard on the wind. June turned a page in the old log and found the neat hand again. Addie's entries belonged to Summers 2 decades back. She wrote like someone who designed bridges and like soup. When lightning mapped the ridges, she had drawn tiny arrows in the margins pointing to strikes that mattered and strikes that were drama only. Next to one line, a watercolor stain had dried in a careful bloom, tea maybe, or a small accident someone had decided to keep. Night after night, the tower kept watch with 2 sets of habits. June made her rounds and did the work the way she had been taught, and the line would lift, or the map would find itself wearing a pencil mark that matched the azimuth she was about to sight, or the Osborne's ring would turn with the lightest suggestion under her hand, as if a second hand rested with hers, steadying rather than steering. There was no theater in it. That was what made it frightening sometimes. The absence of drama. The way a well-placed hand saves a tray from tipping and no one tells a story about it later. A shadow down canyon that wasn't a shadow yet. A suggestion to call the ranch past the old quarry and ask them to check a fence before the afternoon wind learned a bad trick. A note on the back of the rainfall chart in pencil so faint it was only visible when the window held it up to the sky. Leave water at the bottom step for the visitor in September. On the 4th night, the radio hissed with faraway weather and then found quiet. June caught a motion by the lake, a little curl of something that looked like breath on a glass in winter. She set the sight, 212 degrees. Before she could write, the pencil mark lived there, a small 212 with a dot beside it. The dot was new in Addie's marks. Base answered on the first call. Copy your 2, 1, 2. 2 minutes later, phones lit in small places. Someone across the lake walked out to his porch and noticed the line on the horizon change from opinion to fact. Engines that had been sleeping thought about their keys. No sirens, no panic, just a nudge of readiness that meant later nobody would have to run. June kept expecting a moment when the voice would ask something she couldn't give. It didn't. It stayed inside the rules. Don't point your flashlight at the glass. Don't write smoke until smoke is smoke. Call even if you're tired of hearing yourself. Look again. An old hand giving ordinary advice that happened to arrive 30 seconds before ordinary became necessary. The tower was not all counsel. It had its humor. One night, the map drawer stuck the way it does when wood swells. She tugged and let go. The drawer slid itself open with exaggerated politeness, revealing a chocolate bar someone had left where maps live. A paper band around it had a line in that same careful hand. For when the horizon stays the same too long, June ate a square. It tasted like somebody's patience from a summer, when patience had been used up carefully. Once, the mountain revealed its old-fashioned wires. The magnetophone rang 3 short bells, a pattern from a code list no one had used, since the map still showed the ranger station with its first roof. June lifted the receiver to a male voice with a wry fatigue. "Don't call me unless you're bored," the voice said, as if finishing a conversation from a long time ago. June smiled in spite of herself. She said the ridge was fine. The voice softened with a kind of pride that did not need to say itself out loud. "That'll do. Don't go out if the hair on your arm stands up. That's not superstition." Then a click no heavier than the release of a line in a boat. Near dawn, when the sky thought about blue, June did what she always did. She signed her line in the log and tucked her notes under the clip. Tonight she added a second line. For Addie. Thanks. She half expected the graphite to be answered immediately. It wasn't. She set her coffee on the sill and watched light learn the ridges again. A breeze, the smallest possible, turned a page back as if curious. There, under a past entry that belonged to a lightning map, someone had addressed her already. For June, you're doing it the way the place likes. The handwriting was Addie's, or else the mountains, which had learned to write like Addie. Below it, a little arrow pointed to a spot on the wall just above the lowest rail of the west window. June ran her fingers there and found a notch in the wood she'd never seen. Felt like a mark someone makes with a ring without meaning to, except it was too deliberate. Inside the notch lived a tiny folded paper. She worked it out with the tip of the pencil and unfolded it carefully. It said, "If the horizon ever looks wrong and the radio is busy, ring twice, then once. Wait." That line knows tricks. June slid the paper back and left it there, because not everything is for pocketing. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool glass and breathed the scent of dust, coffee, pine, and the faint copper of old wire. The valley opened its day. A pickup traced a fine thread on a far road and disappeared into trees. Her phone, which had been an expensive watch and a camera all week, displayed a message that had arrived before service reached her. A friend in town saying, for no reason except that people sometimes move in concert, "Hey, thinking of you." She wrote that too. Not for record. For company. By the time day shift climbed the stairs, the tower had said all it needed to. Light filled the floor, making the knots in the boards shine like slow stars. June handed off with nothing dramatic to declare. She stepped down into the smell of sun on wood. On the last step, she left a bottle of water, as instructed, without needing to know for whom. In September, someone would arrive exactly as thirsty as that bottle expected. The ridge would accept thanks without questions. And some night, when wind lifted and laid itself down again, and the phone clicked its small, familiar clearing of the throat, the line would carry Addie's ordinary voice. June would listen, and write, and look, and the tower would not be alone. Story number 7. The Municipal Records Building had a way of standing taller after midnight, as if its brick shoulders relaxed when the last daytime elevator ding faded into memory. Elias knew the rhythm of those hours. The hum of fluorescent tubes, the complaint of wheels under a full cart, the soft clap of a file box lid. The lobby smelled like paper and old pencils. A motion sensor watched the doors with a patient green eye. His badge beeped against the reader, and the lobby printer whispered out a thin strip of paper. Name, time, shift code. He tore it free and tucked it in his pocket without looking. The room at the back took his coat. The elevator arrived with its faint metallic sigh. He did not press 13. There was no 13. But the polished panel, smudged with fingerprints, showed a pale square where a missing number should have been. When he looked directly at it, there was nothing. When he looked at the reflection of the panel in the brushed steel, a dim little 13 was briefly there, as shy as a breath on glass. The door slid shut. The third floor held maps. Rolled tubes of old city plans lived in drawers that opened like long piano keys. Elias logged each drawer that night with practiced hands, scanning the labels, muttering street names under his breath in a rhythm that kept him moving. Outside the windows, a streetlight poured a steady cone of honeyed light over an empty bus stop. Somewhere, a sign rattled itself back to sleep. The hallway camera screen on the desk flickered. He glanced at it because everyone does. A reflex. The timestamp crawled ahead. His own figure crossed the frame in the feed, pushing a cart. He paused, because he was not moving. He was leaning at the desk with the ink pen between his fingers. In the screen, past him, but not him. A second elevator door opened to show an empty car with the floor indicator idling at B. He lifted the pen, the cap clicked back on, and the sound echoed longer than it should have. He told himself the feed lagged. Buildings breathed. Monitors caught their compa, breath. When he reached for the next drawer, the label had already been scanned and checked in neat handwriting. His handwriting, the initials matched the way his own hand tried to be careful. The lower curve of the S dragged a little, as if the ink had caught. He frowned, and his first thought was a simple one. Someone else on a similar shift must have doubled up the task. He called the oversight line and let it ring until the recorded message asked him to try again later. An elevator bell sounded, a polite kitchen timer chime that had no reason to greet him from the end of the hall. He took the cart anyway, because work is easier when it makes a path. The light inside the elevator was warmer than the hall, softer, not the flat white of the building's long tubes. The panel's smooth face watched him. The 3 he had ridden to glowed. Below it, 2 and 1 and L. Past that, a slim seam in the pets of the brass, the way a seam in a coat tells you a pocket exists, where you can't see it. He stepped back out, because suddenly the elevator seemed like a small room on a ship. It seemed to move a little before the doors even closed. Night buildings keep their own weather. On 4, the archive air settled heavy in his ears. He heard a cart somewhere that wasn't his own. The sound of it was identical rubber wheels, a tick when it rolled over the paint stripe at the door. He parked his cart and waited. The sound matched his breathing. When he stopped breathing, the sound went on. and then also stopped, politely, as if not to step on his quiet. A sign-in clipboard lay on the counter at the corner with a sheet for after-hours access. Elias wrote his name and the time. He moved on. On his next pass, it had 2 entries. His name again, earlier than the one he remembered writing by 3 minutes. The numbers were tidy, no smudge in the ink. If a joke, it was a careful one. He went to the security desk in the lobby for the sense of neutral ground. The desk had a row of screens, a little forest of angled glass. One screen held the bare stairwell. Another watched the loading dock where moths made bold little arcs on the camera's infrared night vision. On the main screen, a quad view divided up the floors. At the bottom, the basement level moaned softly through before the HVAC fans spun back to a steady purr. In the corner of the frame, the elevator bank lived its simple life. Doors opening to show no one, doors closing to reflect the lobby's blankness, piano strings of steel cables whispering out of sight. The far left camera caught the edge of the lobby doors. Outside, past glass and the sleeping city, a passing delivery van threw slow stripes of light across the floor and went on. In the elevator's display digital, practical, each floor number brightened in an orderly climb. L, 1, 2, 3. The doors in the screen peeled open. Within the image, for a fraction of a fraction, he saw the same cart he used. The same faint dent in the front right corner. The same piece of masking tape on the handle, where he had written Cart B with a too thick marker. It slid forward, not pushed, rolling on its own inertia, and then stopped as neatly as if a hand had steadied it. He became aware that his own hand had felt a small chill, the kind of cold that comes with reading a label on food and realizing it is not yours. The overhead lights hummed more loudly as if someone had turned other lights on somewhere deeper in the building. Elias checked the printer by his knee without meaning to. The thin strip of paper he had torn earlier, his receipt, he took it out and finally looked. It showed his first sign-in time and, beneath it, the line for sign-out already printed, with a time filled in that had not yet come. 3:1 a.m. The paper did not look like a prediction so much as a confident memory. He told himself it was a glitch. He told himself not to be strange about small things in a quiet place. He decided to stick to his list and let the building be itself. It had existed a long time, longer than his hours among its file cabinets, and the people whose names were typed on brittle cards. On 6, the doors made a particular sound he had never noticed before. The hush of thick weather, stripping, followed by the click of a reluctant latch. The long rows of shelves smelled like cardboard, and the faint sweetness of ancient paste. He counted boxes. 1 row over, another set of shelf lights had been left on. He turned them off to save power. Heard them click back on behind him moments later. Not stubborn, not defiant, just out of sequence. He turned and saw the light spill at his feet stop just before his shoes. On the 7th floor landing, someone had taped a small printed warning. Backup generator test 230, 245. Do not use elevators. He looked at his receipt's printed future and saw the sign's bracketed minutes sitting just inside it. He took the stairs, more for the feeling that stairs made sense than any real rule. Each floor settled into its own small story. A drink ring on a table, a chair left exactly not quite under, a stack of binders with the top one upside down, a clock with no battery. He passed fire doors with the reassuring weight of cold metal and windows that showed him slices of the city's sleeping roofs. Below, the basement landing smelled like a workshop. Old seals, dust, a clean trace of oil. Here, the echo lengthened. He could hear the generator begin its controlled cough and spin. The lights stuttered, and then steadied into a new, slightly yellower hum. He watched the needles on a panel climb and settle. The building held its breath, and then breathed again. He turned into a corridor with a wall-length convex mirror at the far end, the kind designed to show 2 directions at once. He saw himself with the cart, grown slightly curved and toy-sized by the mirror's eye. Behind him, the hall bent around something he could not see directly. He stopped to test the mirror's distance. His reflection stopped, as rules suggest, with the cart's front wheel pointed gently left. He stood still to judge the tilt. In the curve, the small version of himself adjusted the wheel a little more. It could have been his eyes playing with angles. It could have been the slow lag of a mind that wants a thing to be ordinary. He lifted one hand. In the mirror, the hand lifted. Only then, already turned halfway away, he noticed a second cart in the far curve. It was the same dented front. The mirror made it seem as if two identical hallways existed at the same time. The sign-out receipts at the security desk had multiplied by the time he returned. The printer whispered without being asked. He picked up the topmost slip. The time was the same 3-1. The next two showed 3-5 and 3-9, all with his name in clean block letters and a small checkmark by the word exit. He did not remember checking anything. He looked for the camera that watched the printer, forgetting for a moment that cameras watch and do not explain. The building directory screen near the door cycled slowly through tenant names in a civic font. Assessment office, planning, archives, maps. For a breath, between archives and maintenance, another word ghosted across the glass, resident. The letters were too fast to wipe at, too slow to be dismissed as a trick of the eye. He cupped his hands against the glass and saw only his own face, thinner in the reflection than it felt to be. He decided to leave by the book. He keyed in his ID to the exit reader and heard the satisfying click that meant compliance and permission. The lobby doors parted, and cool outside air touched his face with the smallest taste of rain. He stepped into it like a swimmer into a black lake surface. The street looked nearly painted, a still life of dumpsters and one orange traffic cone, and nothing moving. He pulled the door so that it closed with its safe little thump. He waited. He should have felt lighter. He did not. His phone buzzed. An email from building security slid across the lock screen. Sign. Inconfirmed. 2:50, 6 a.m. It showed a digital version of the thin strip in his pocket, complete with the little pre-printed farewell. He stood on the sidewalk and looked back through the glass. The lobby looked empty and correct. The desk exactly where he left it. The screens tucked behind their reflective angles. He had the app for the cameras. Everyone had it, though no one admitted watching on nights off. He opened it and let the lobby feed drip into focus. The desk appeared. The corner plant did its best to pretend it was alive. In the chair at the desk sat a man wearing his coat. The man's head was turned toward the elevator bank, as if listening. Elias, outside, raised one hand, a breathless wave that felt foolish in a city that did not watch. On the screen, the man at the desk lifted his own hand a second later and waved politely at something behind the camera. Then he stood, smooth and purposeful, and pushed a cart that was no longer there toward the waiting elevator. The doors slid open obligingly. The cart went in. The man followed. The doors closed. The message in his pocket rustled as if it wanted to be read again. He took the receipt out and saw that the paper had one more line below the predicted 3-1. It was not a time. It was a word. Good night. The font was the building's favorite. Neutral, municipal, meant to be boring. He folded the strip, and it made a soft crackle like leaves. Streetlights tend to buzz more when it's quiet. The light above the door made a circle on the sidewalk and dimmed, brightened, dimmed. In the glass, he saw his own small figure, and behind it the faint suggestion of a second set of lobby doors that did not exist in the day. For reasons he would not later try to impose on the moment, Elias turned and walked, slowly, not hurried, toward the corner. He did not look up at the windows where the pale breathing lines of fluorescence laid their steady lanes across the floors. He kept his hands at his sides, his phone cold against his palm, while the city exhaled one long, patient breath around him. Nobody followed him. The building made no move. And yet, at the corner, he paused, because habit asked him to look back at the place he had left. The directory screen on the wall, visible through the glass, cycled once more. Archives, maintenance, a blank pause that could have been an erased smudge. Then one more gentle scroll. Resident. The letters did not wait this time. They settled for a full second, as if they had found their place. From somewhere deep in the grid of ducts and files, a cartwheel made a quiet, knowing tick as it crossed a paint stripe. The sound was innocuous, almost friendly, like a small thing returning to its groove. The night shuffled a little closer, and the city politely let him choose whether to come back when morning turned the building's face to glass and Sunday. Somewhere high up, a light switched off and another switched on, putting everything back to how it should be, how it had been, and how it would keep being for anyone who signed their name and waited for the printer to whisper back. Story number 8. The hilltop station wore its red tower lights like a lighthouse that had forgotten the ocean. The guy wires sang in the wind with a sound almost too low to hear, and the gravel parking lot shone with a chalky glow under the moon. Inside, the overnight studio held a square of warm light and the comfortable clutter of an old place that keeps doing its job. Foam panels, a dented kettle, pens in a coffee mug with a rubbed-away logo. Mara ran the board with steady hands. At 1:05, the playlist slid into a string of midnight ballads. The meters nodded. A light on the phone blinked polite green. Request line. She let it ring twice, then lifted the receiver. No voice. Not quite silence either. More a soft, open space. A room tone that didn't belong to the room she was in. She spoke the standard greeting, the station's call letters, and frequency. The silence broke into a breath that sounded like wind over a microphone. Then, with the gentle delay of a satellite call, her own words came back to her, slightly older, as if they had traveled all the way around the night and returned. She put the receiver down with care and checked the air monitor. Her voice was where it should be. The call light stopped blinking. She kept her routine close. At the top of the hour, she did the legal ID, smiling because smiling changes the sound. At 1:15, she read the community calendar, short and simple. A library fundraiser, a church rummage sale, an invitation to a farmer's market that would set up long after the station fell asleep for the day. In the little window that faced the tower, the red beacons blinked and never lost count. The emergency alert box on the rack wore its serious face. It had a small screen and a tiny printer that made its own snow of thin paper. The engineering log said to expect the monthly test at 2:17. Mara placed a fresh strip in the printer, not because she believed in exactly on-time tests, but because ritual holds the edges of long hours together. The rack fans sighed behind the panels. In the corner, an older radio played the station back with the 7-second delay that protects live shows from mistakes. It was a habit of hers to keep it low. Tonight, the delay made itself known. Her voice on the room speakers and her voice in the little radio spoke together like two people trying to finish each other's sentences. She slid the delay unit back to reset the buffer. The readout stuttered and then climbed as expected. 3 seconds, 5, 7. The louder radio swallowed the softer, and the world went on. At 1:44, the fax machine woke itself. It hadn't been needed in months, but the building kept machines as if they were keepsakes. The rollers pulled a page through, with a warm, careful sound. Mara watched, unwilling to be curious and failing at it anyway. The header showed the station's number. The body of the page carried a list of song titles, neat as a grocery list, in a font the station no longer used. They matched the next hour's playlist down to the mistyped artist name on track 3, but shifted by 7 minutes, each entry quietly closer to the bottom of the hour than the copy on her screen. At the bottom, where a signature line would live, the word "stay" appeared, centered and unembellished. She set the fax aside. Machines did things. Old software woke like sleepers, startled by a dream. Gus, the engineer, liked his sticky notes. One clung under the board, refolded too many times. Tapped the generator gauge at 2. The night had been still enough to forget the outside entirely. Mara took the narrow hallway past the record library, where album sleeves leaned like tired books, and opened the back door. The air smelled like dry weeds and something far away that was about to rain. The tower's red blink felt slower out here, where the seconds stretched. The generator sat under its aluminum shroud. She tapped the gauge. The needle lifted, thought about it, and settled. Through the chain link, the fields rolled down to the road in that soft way night makes of distance. She listened. No cars. No animals. The wires hummed in their long, taut lines, and for a moment the hum made a tune she almost recognized, the kind of melody that turns up in a childhood memory and leaves without a name. She went back in. At 2:01, the phone rang once and stopped, as if whoever was on the other end was reminding themselves that they didn't mean to call. At 2:06, a new light lit on the rack, labeled Tower Site. It was the remote alarm that only came alive if someone opened the transmitter building. She pressed the acknowledge button. The light stayed on. The tiny screen offered a brief sentence: manual control enabled. Sites like theirs were never manned at night. The wind found an edge somewhere and made the building creak in that reasonable, aged way that always sounds like footsteps until proven otherwise. She put her headphones on not to shut anything out, but to be in only one room for a while. The Q channel let her listen to what would go next, a lullaby from a local artist who sent cookies with his CDs. She slipped the fader up until it whispered under the current song like fog under a streetlight. The lyrics were simple and kind. On the delay radio, 7 seconds behind, the same song began before she pushed it. The opening guitar, the breath, the first word the radio sang her future at her, soft and inevitable. She stopped the track on her board. The radio didn't stop. It played on in a gentle, unembarrassed way. She pinched the bridge of her nose and laughed once, because sometimes you laugh when you are not sure which path is the right one to pretend is normal. The EAS box trilled its small, bureaucratic melody. A test should begin with that familiar ducking sound and a set of tones. Instead, the printer purred and offered a Plicy. Single line. Received prior. It wasn't a sentence the manual recognized. She read the line to herself as if that would make it less odd. The second line followed. This message has already aired. She could have torn the paper and thrown it away and declared the test done out of mercy for future paperwork. She watched the tower light blink through the little window instead. At 2:20, the request line blinked again. She answered with care. A voice like her own, but further away, said the legal ID in a slow, thoughtful tone, then added a phrase the station didn't use. License to you, as if the license sat like a small card in every listener's pocket. She checked the clock reflexively. The second hand had discovered a longer route around the face. She set the receiver down and let the dial tone wash the room in a low, even C. Every show had its closing phrase, something warm and simple. Hers was, "See you on the other side of morning." At 2:37, her voice said it on the delay radio. She had not reached that hour, nor the end of her playlist. The song after her sign-off followed. A piece she had not loaded from any folder she could name. A field recording of wind along a fence wire, and a bell that may have been a buoy, or a lantern gently nudged. It lasted exactly 7 minutes. She wrote in the log with her neat block letters, the sort school teaches for clarity. The page took the ink without argument. When she turned to the next sheet, the imprint of her handwriting pressed into it, faint and backward, as if she had already filled it in, and the paper remembered. The times were close to the minute. The last line had no time. It had a word instead, the same one from the fax, though she had not written it. Stay. The station's sounder sneaked in the soft chime that began local news, and rarely traveled at night. A newsbed started, then settled back down, politely excusing itself. Outside, a car finally passed on the road below, its headlights tracing the ragged edge of a hedgerow, reminding the station and the hill and Mara herself that other lives existed on this clock. She chose the next song on purpose, something bright, something morning-shaped. She spoke between tracks with a smile. Her voice sounded like someone who belongs in a quiet place. The tower light blinked. The wires sang. The request line did not light again. The delay radio returned to its job of being second. At 3, the top of hour tone she didn't trigger tapped the air. The legal ID played. It was her voice, kinder than she felt, perfectly on time. The final sentence added itself, soft as a hand on a shoulder. Do not leave us with silence. She nodded once, as if taking instruction from a future that did not mean harm. She faded in the next song, slow and sure, and watched the meters move like breathing. The night, content to be kept company, leaned a little closer to the red-lit window and listened back. Story number 9. Rain pressed the street into a mirror, making the bookstore's neon sign look like a handwriting lesson come to life. Inside, the lamps were kind and low. Paper held the sweet, dusty scent of afternoons that never happened. Rowan liked the way the bell over the door kept its manners at night, ringing softly even when the wind nudged the frame. He was covering late because the town's festival had stolen every other pair of hands. A warm mug sat by the register, cooling enough to forget what it had been. Somewhere among the stacks, a dehumidifier made a purposeful little hum. He ticked checkboxes on the closing list with the even calm of someone who has practiced ending days. A donation box waited under the counter, the kind with awkward tape that clung to itself. It held a single book. Dark cloth binding. No title on the spine. No jacket. He set it on the mat to log it. The cloth was dry in a way that suggested it had spent the rain under something patient. Inside the cover, no ex libris, no name. Only a penciled oval, like someone had tried to draw a seal and thought better of it. On the first page, a margin carried 3 words, in small, careful graphite. Turn to 12. He smiled because people wrote in books like they were talking with a friend they trusted. He flipped to page 12. The text was ordinary, an essay about winter gardens. In the gutter, a line of pencil. The kettle will decide to be loud now. As if on cue, the tin kettle in the back warmed itself into a soft tick that became a single hollow pop. Pipes, he told himself. Heat and water invent the theater they need. He looked around for mischief and found none. He took the pencil from the jar, balanced it in his fingers, and wrote very small above the line. Who are you? The dot on the question mark felt far too dark. He watched the graphite like it might answer. It did not. He set the book aside, embarrassed by the small leap in his pulse. The front door glass whispered under a short gust. A bus rolled past with 3 people in the blue light. Faces turned toward their own reflections. The bell did not ring. No one came in. Rowan lifted the book again, less to read than to put something between himself and the window. New writing had appeared under his question. Same pencil, same tidy hand. The window knows your name. He stood, walked to the glass, and saw only the layered room. His small silhouette, the soft lamps, the ladder that lived in the cookbooks aisle where tall authors lived at eye level. He checked the security camera on the tablet because that made sense. The feed was live. The little time counter in the corner marched along. He laughed at himself and the small bravado of standing straighter when no one was looking. The next margin note waited 2 pages later, as if it had always been there. Check under the travel shelf, bottom. He told himself that whoever had owned the book liked games. He told himself that finding a prize would mean a story to tell at breakfast. He crouched by the travel shelf and slid a hand behind a tangle of glossy spines. His fingers found paper, a Polaroid with a white border gone cream with years. The picture showed this window. The neon sign, the lamp behind it, the crooked reflection of a ladder. Rain turned the street into a rope of light. In the far left, a person stood at the bus stop, coat too large, head turned away. The timestamp in the corner read tonight's date, printed by a camera that had no business knowing it. He felt for a moment a very old kind of quiet, the kind that came from being watched by a kind intention or a memory that had kept a seat for him. He slid the photo back where he found it. The book lay open on the counter, its pages lifting a little in a draft he couldn't name. Another line had appeared, the hand so consistent it could have been a typeface. Do not open for the knock. He almost smiled to undo the sentence's weight. Warnings always sound formal. His jaw ticked once, and then remembered how to be still. The clock found past. He turned the open sign because he always closed early when rain pushed the town flat. He counted the drawer and initialed the line. He stacked a small pyramid of books to reshelve, the top one about birds that return to cities they've never seen. The knock, when it came, sounded polite. One firm note. He didn't move. The bell did not ring. The tablet's camera feed showed the smeared oval of a raincoat hood and nothing else. He waited and let the knock become a past idea. The margin accepted his stillness and offered a thank you in pencil so light it could have been a smudge. He found himself whispering, "You're welcome," and then breathed out the habit. He tried a test for the sake of rules. He wrote on a blank part of the page, "Tell me something I can use." The answer did not appear there. It appeared at the top of the next page, as if the book respected spaces. "Third car is yours, Q." It meant little until headlights slid along the wall, long and slow, and then a second set, thinner, and then a third. The old sedan with the missing hubcap that he had parked by the hydrant he shouldn't. He laughed again, softer now, feeling how a voice fills a room differently when it's not for anyone else. The kettle offered another pop. He took it off heat and poured just to soothe the noise. The sound of water into cup braided with the sound rain made while rethinking its plans. The book waited without impatience. He turned the page and found a different kind of note. A list of small kindnesses, written like steps. Lock the small case. Flip the rug corner flat. Leave the umbrella by the door. It isn't yours. Turn the lamp in poetry just so. He did each one. Last, the line he had not wanted. Leave me open when you go. He told himself it was a ritual of closing. The list could have been a barista's wipe down. A pilot's landing. The store looked right when he finished. A snapshot of a room not empty, but resting. He took his coat. The third car had been his cue, if cues meant anything on a wet night. At the door, he paused, because people do. He looked back to fix the image of the room in his head, the way a traveler checks a hotel drawer one last time. The book's page had filled with one more sentence, small, accurate. Turn the sign so it watches inward. He reached and did, and the word open looked at him from inside the glass where it could do less harm. He stepped out, pulled the door, tested the lock, and stood in the cool porch of rain. Across the street, no bus now, no figure in a coat. The neon made its slow loop. He held his umbrella closed because the rain was almost kind. Before he turned away, the bell above the door sounded once, too light to be the door itself, an exhale more than a note. He risked a last glance through the glass. The book lay open where he left it, its page smooth. He could not read the margin from here. He did not need to. In the morning he would log a donation, one cloth-bound, unmarked. He would shelf it under essays, because it wanted to be near simple things. He would not mention the Polaroid to anyone. Some nights help you close, and their payment is to be left whole. He lifted his umbrella. The third car, faithful by the hydrant, blinked its mirrors with leftover rain. He walked into the street's long breath. Behind him, the lamp in poetry glowed for a beat, then settled as if a hand had found the switch without moving the air. Story number 10. The conservatory wore the rain like a second skin. Glass panels ticked as temperature shifted, and the iron ribs of the old Victorian frame exhaled fog into the aisles. Under the arc of the central dome, leaves caught beads of water and held them like secrets. Timers clicked. Far-off fans turned. The whole place breathed in cycles, a greenhouse heart with a slow, patient rhythm. Anna let the door ease itself close behind her. The night guard had slid the bolt for her and wished her good luck with the bloom. Her badge still glowed green from the reader. In her pocket, the folded map of the Palm House felt unnecessary. She knew every bend of the pathway, as well as the lines of her own palm. She raised the hood of her coat, then let it fall. The air here had its own weather, warm as a summer fairy, wet as memory. Tonight was for the night-blooming cereus. It had been building toward this for weeks, the bud lifting its pale head a little more each evening. People lined up for these in day hours when publicity had time to shout. But this one had decided on a rain wedge Tuesday, well past visiting time. She checked the humidity on her meter good and the soil better. On the chalkboard sign she wrote a small note. Anticipated after midnight. An audio guide pedestal near the entrance was supposed to be asleep. Its button glowed the faintest red, like an ember trying not to bother anyone. As she passed, a child's voice rose from its speaker, clear and measured, the kind of voice used to read to classrooms. If you are very quiet, you can hear plants reorganize themselves. The guide clicked, thought better of itself, and fell silent. Anna glanced at the module out of habit. No one had programmed that script. The current tour talked about roots and canopy and sustainability, not secrets. She moved along the path, shoes whispering over the rubber matting. Misters lifted a curtain across the fern house. She parted it with a hand and watched tiny droplets ring her fingers like glass dust. Water made a cone of sound in the lily pool. Beyond the reflection, something like her own shape moved. She stepped right. The shadow stepped left, not opposite, not mirroring, just choosing a different way. It was a trick of angled glass, she told herself. There were places here where three panes met, and the world doubled back on itself. At the service gate, a small sensor kept the visitor count. Habit. Grants like numbers. It should have sat at 0. The LCD blinked from 0 to 1. As if someone had entered behind her. She waved a hand in front of it, let it count her, watched the number climb to 2, then pressed the reset and laughed aloud at the sound it made trying to be official. The screen returned to 0 obediently. She went on. On the bench beside the vanilla orchid, A laminated card leaned in the corner as if someone had left a postcard and changed their mind. She lifted it. The front showed a photo of the conservatory from decades ago. Vines wilder, railings painted a stern green, a sign in copperplate that said "Keep to Paths." Behind the glass in the picture, a blur that could have been someone pausing to look up at the dome. On the back, a sentence typewritten neatly, "The moths will find you if you keep the air still." She set it back where it had been. No one typed here. No one had a ribbon that would make letters like that. The Sirius waited on its pedestal, with the quiet focus of someone preparing a toast. Anna dimmed the overhead grow lights one step to keep heat from building. The petals had loosened. The outermost inch had a slackness that told her it was time. She set the stool. She took a breath and felt relief arrive, the kind that shows up when a long watch becomes a moment instead of a line. Behind her, the audio pedestal woke again with a soft chirp. A different voice this time, older, amused. "Notice the benches. They were designed to keep you a little less comfortable than you want, so you won't sit too long and make the house forget you." Anna smiled despite herself. Someone had had fun with the script. She made a note to ask in the morning who had written a late-night version of the tour. Another timer ticked. A door somewhere clicked and released as the building adjusted its vents. A strand of warm air stroked her ankle. She turned the page of her small notebook to log the change and found her own handwriting already there. 12:40. 3 vent opens, south. She had not written it yet, but there it was, her careful block letters, the exact way she crossed her sevens. She lifted the page and held it to the light, half expecting to see an imprint from some previous note. The sheet above was blank. On the glass above the bromeliads, condensation drew its own map. Lines gathered, broke, gathered again, and for a blink, she thought she saw a floor plan, then a star, then simply the way water likes to go. When she wiped a finger through it, the line closed behind her touch a second later, not a clean seal but a soft knit edge. The sound of rain deepened, like applause in another room. The occupancy sensor by the service gate chimed once. From 0, it crept to 1, then 2. She stood very still. Leaves did what leaves do. Adjusted slightly. Returned to their first idea. "If you are here," she said in a voice she would have used for a shy cat, "be kind." The conservatory answered with a drip perfectly timed to sound like approval. The bloom began. It happens with a certain etiquette. The outer petals bowed back first, as though the flower were taking a small step out of its own way. Then the inner ones followed. Slow, measured, generous. A pale halo took shape. In that widening circle, shadows crowded and then loosened. She had seen this before in other years, and still felt a ceremony reach around the moment and button it closed. A moth did come, big as a small hand, soft gray, making a path that knew this house better than she did. It hovered, decided, and landed so lightly that the flower seemed to nod. Anna did not move. The audio pedestal respected the quiet. The rain lost some of its argument with the glass. At the dome's highest pane, a low glow unfurled like a hidden moon. The outside streetlights couldn't reach that angle. It pulsed once, like the long blink of a patient thing. For a second she saw clearly the profile of the old conservatory as it had been. Railings new, vines untamed, the copperplate sign shining. Then it was the present again, modern signage, discreet benches, labels in the accessible font. Her map crackled in her pocket. When she unfolded it, a small pencil dot on the page moved, then settled. "You are here," the caption said. And the dot sat a little to the left of where it had been printed. She folded the map again and let the paper decide its own crease. When the bloom settled fully, it made a quiet, barely audible sound, like a breath being set down. Anna wrote the time in her notebook. The line after it had already been filled. 19 Thank you for keeping watch. The handwriting matched hers and didn't. She let the pen hover, and then put a careful check mark beside the phrase as if to agree. On her way out, she paused at the entrance to take one last look under the dome. The bench by the vanilla orchid had the small memory of someone having sat and then stood. The laminated postcard had turned itself so the typewritten words faced in. On the chalkboard by the Sirius, a second hand had written a shorter note under hers in neat, almost old-fashioned script. Late, but right on time. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine silver. The guard nodded her through with the drowsy salute of someone who trusts certain places to behave. Anna stepped into the night. The glass house behind her lowered its lights one notch. Another breath let out, another kept. Above the door, the visitor counter returned to 0 on its own. Then, thoughtful, flicked to 1 and stayed there. The moths, perhaps, or the kind of guest who comes back when the house is again at rest. And now, the stories grow quiet. Their echoes fade like footsteps into distance, leaving only stillness behind. The night holds steady, calm, and unbroken, waiting for you to rest within it. Let your eyes close, let your thoughts drift, and allow sleep to carry you gently where it will. The stories will wait here, patient and silent, whenever you return. Good night.